Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we are excited to have you guys listening and join us today. Around the table, I have Liberty McArtor. Thank you for joining us today, Liberty.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun.
It is fun. You're now, I would say, a Millennial Roundtable regular.
Well, yeah, I enjoy it. I'm glad for the opportunity. I'm always looking forward to when we can have these discussions. So
lots to talk about today. Also joining us on the line is Jonathan Teague. He's with us from Prestonwood Baptist Church. He's the minister to married adults. Thank you for being with us today, Jonathan.
Well, it's great to be with you all. Hope everybody is a lot warmer today than we were a week ago.
Oh, well, I don't know if we could have even done the show a week ago, just with the power outages and everything. We are definitely going to talk about Texas, and I would love to hear about everyone's experiences with it, although I know Texans around the state all had their own struggles in the last week. So we'll definitely be talking about that here in the first hour. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the Republican Party, and Texas is shifting gears a little bit. The makeup of the Republican Party is changing. I know I, as a Republican, am looking forward to see what our party dynamic will look like in the next few years and in 4 years. So we will be talking about some recent news and updates on that. And then later on in the show, we'll talk about the Equality Act, which Congress is considering right now, and the potential impacts that would have on us as a nation, as well as Planned Parenthood's annual report came out. Lots to grieve about there, but also very telling about the direction that our country's going when it comes to abortion. So we have a full show lined up, but today we're going to start with Texas and the snow apocalypse. There is so much to unpack here, and it's actually evolving and changing almost by the hour, because most of the Texans listening here were impacted by the storm last week and know firsthand all the implications from that. But then from there, investigations have been called on by the Texas Attorney General's office. Governor Abbott spoke to Texans last night and called for investigations. The board of ERCOT, the group charged with maintaining the grid, has resigned. And now they're having to go through hearings before the Texas legislature to answer for everything that happened last week. So there's a lot to unpack, a lot of moving pieces. But first, I'll just talk to our audience, in case you are not in Texas, about what happened last week, because my sister, for instance, is from Texas originally, but lived in California, and still, as of last Thursday, did not understand exactly what was going on. She's like, wait, why is there no water now? What's going on? And so most Texans who are listening did live through this and know that there were a few categories. You were either full power all the time last week, doing all right. You were supposed to be on rolling blackouts, which turned into 10-hour blackouts with 1.5 hours of power, which is where my family was. So our house got in the 40s if you were in that scenario, because it was 2 degrees outside for all this. Or you were in the category without, you either had real rolling blackouts or no power whatsoever. So those were kind of the categories. I fell in the, my house got so cold, we ended up going to in-laws, which we were very grateful for. They live close to a hospital, so we think maybe they were in a safety zone of sorts. So we went and thawed out there. But what about you, Liberty? What was your situation last week?
I would say we were lucky in that we had truly rolling outages. So, lucky last week means that, you did have power sometimes, I guess. So we we would probably have power for most of the week for maybe 15, 30 minutes at a time, and then
Oh,
off for
okay.
up to an hour at a time. So it was chilly, but our house never got dangerously cold. Thankfully, we have a gas starting fireplace, so we did not stock up on wood ahead of time.
Oh no.
we thankfully neighbors and church members as well came in clutch, and they had extra, so we were able to keep the fireplace going and kind of huddle in the living
good.
room. But I definitely had a lot of neighbors, family members that lived in other towns nearby that where their house got down into the 30s, including my elderly grandfather, who thankfully was able to go to some family members' house, because they went hours and hours and hours without power. So it was, it did get to be kind of a dire situation for a lot of people because it was so cold. And it was really kind of luck of the draw of whether you had power or didn't, it was really rolling or, so it was tough.
Yeah. I'm so grateful too for so many Texans who opened up their homes and did
Yes.
whatever they could to get water to people. We were really grateful. We had multiple friends just, posting on Instagram or Facebook, if you need warmth, come here.
Yes.
What about you guys, Jonathan? You're a little bit in my area. What did you guys experience with your family?
It's crazy. Obviously, first and foremost, if you don't live in Texas, you wouldn't know that today in Dallas-Fort Worth, it's 75 degrees. So
Thought out quickly.
oh my goodness. But yeah, it's really interesting. For our family in particular, amazingly, we never lost power. We were in that first category. We never lost power. We never lost heat. We had neighbors that did in various degrees in various ways. And so, it was crazy to watch. And we had friends all over the state that had much different situations here locally that had much different situations. A lot of people, Chelsey, like what you were describing, where they had to go stay somewhere else. So we were relatively unscathed in that regard, which we were grateful for. So we just tried to be available, to help people that needed something, neighbors or whatever. But it was pretty crazy, particularly for my kids to watch all this happen. And just, 2021 and 2020 have been two really fascinating years in a lot of ways. And so just another one of those 10-year events in Texas where it can happen, and the fallout from it has been pretty crazy, obviously.
Yes, it's been really crazy because in addition to the heat and electricity issue, Texas houses are not built, we know, for their pipes to freeze. So the pipes freeze, and then when they begin to thaw, they crack and break and have leaks and flooding houses. And one friend of ours sent a video from his apartment of chairs floating in his apartment because of the massive amounts of water that came through. Yeah. And so then there were water issues, and I'm a little confused on this because I'm not a scientist, but clean water became an issue because I think there was such a depletion of water at the time that they weren't able to purify it maybe as quickly as they should have or as thoroughly as they should have. And so then multiple counties already under emergency order went under emergency order for created boil notices saying boil your water, make sure that it's safe to drink. So that was another issue. And then of course, people having their ceilings cave in from floods. We are in a pier and beam house, so that's the reason one of the reasons our pipes broke. But it was all under the house. And in my head, if it happens under the house, it doesn't exist. So, but we did have to go get drinking water. Everyone did. And I'm grateful that it wasn't more devastating of an impact on lives than it was, but we still lost. The last number I saw was around 50 lives, which is just horrible. Fires happened, and I don't want to make light of it because I think it was really devastating for a lot of people who did lose family members or lose their lives, or had family members, for instance, in nursing homes. I have a friend whose father didn't have people showing up to work to change him or help get him food at his nursing home, and so there's a lot of stories out there that I'm sure we'll have yet to hear, but I am grateful for the thaw. I am grateful that we are, on the path to getting clean water. And when we get back, we'll talk about what all of this means from the energy perspective, because that is the dialogue happening right now.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we've been unpacking the Texas winter storm, snowpocalypse, whatever you call it in your home. It was a rough week for Texans. It's been rough. You know, I was talking to some members of the legislature yesterday, and I was like, Texas, we just need a break. Everybody just needs a break collectively in the world right now. But last week was not the break we were talking about. Most of us got breaks from work, but it was so that we could survive in our homes. And look, I'll be the first to say I'm not a pioneer woman. I learned this last week when my husband said, hey, we're going to have rolling blackouts. We had them all night. He went and chopped wood helpfully in the garage, and I started cleaning the floors because I panicked. I just started panic cleaning because I just didn't know what else to do. That was not helpful. But we, over the break, were talking about how beautiful it was to see communities come together, neighborhoods come together during a season where we've largely been isolated from one another. We've largely distanced ourselves socially from one another, including helping one another, and just by the nature of COVID and being on lockdown for a year. You know, one of my friends texted me and was like, people don't even look at each other in the eyes anymore. You're so busy looking at their mask, or like, is it on or is it on correctly? And, you know, there's been a lot of, I would say, like dehumanizing in the last year, not just, I think, because of COVID where we can't see each other or smile at each other, but also because, you know, of the rhetoric that's out there. You know, there's just so much animosity towards different people groups and factions in society. But in Texas, it was really refreshing to see like how everyone supported each other and came together. You know, I know our neighbors were sharing firewood and giving food to each other and doing grocery runs and helping get water for people. I know that Andrew, one of our producers, was saying that his somebody lent the Jeep out and just drove around with wood in the back of it to give to people for free. Did you guys see much of that in your own neighborhoods?
Definitely. We moved to a new town here in North Texas last May, and I could not have been more thankful just seeing. I mean, I already liked our town, but seeing everybody come together. I mean, we had city council members that were passing out bottles of water after many people's water got shut off and we were under a boil water notice. And like I said, we didn't prepare as we should have because, you know, we've never known what do you have to do to prepare for something like this. But we had neighbors that gave us some of their firewood so that we could stay warm. We had members from our church driving by, delivering firewood to people. So many local churches and community centers and even a local police department opened up as warming centers for people.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So, I mean, I could go on and on with examples, but it was just, you know, in the midst of trying to check on people every, you know, hour when the power came on for a minute and text and see like, are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was able to just see so many people in our community and our neighbors, you know, really stepping out and helping each other. And I was very proud to be a Texan in that moment because when the going gets rough, like we come together and we help each other out.
I love that. I love that. Jonathan, did you get to see that too? I know you're a part of a church. Were you guys able to get out there and help people on the icy roads?
You know, it's pretty awesome. I mean, just to Liberty's point about, you know, and by the way, Liberty being a newer Texan, like this is not how it is every winter. But it's crazy to, you know, to watch people respond. I think you're right, Chelsey. It's, you know, it has been such a tumultuous 15 months or so, and to see people, you know, kind of be at their best in a lot of ways and remember the stuff that we're good at. And you hate that crisis brings that out, but crisis always brings that out. You know, I think I know people in Dallas where friends in our church and deacons in our church and people in our life groups, you know, just our groups ministry where they were finding out about other members in our church and they were, you know, dropping off bottles of water or saying, hey, come stay at our house where we have heat and power. You know, dropping off meals and people that we have in assisted living centers where, you know, groups were, volunteers were checking on people and just kind of doing a full court press. And a lot of it was just people doing whatever they could, you know, whatever they could do, they were doing. So if they couldn't leave their house, but a neighbor could walk over, they opened their door. If they could get in their truck and, you know, hit the 4-wheel drive and deliver firewood or food or whatever, like they did that. And so, you know, we had people who were literally helping people turn their water mains off so their houses wouldn't flood. And, you know, older, elderly folks living on a street where people were coming by and literally like sweeping water out of an entryway so they wouldn't slip and fall, or that literally it wouldn't ice over because it was 30 degrees in their house. I mean, incredibly crazy stories. And yet, yeah, I mean, people stepped up and they took care of each other. And yeah, that's definitely a Texas thing. I think Texans are kind of known for like, hey, when stuff gets bad, we're gonna you know, bond together. But you know, certainly a lot of the believers that I knew, they were doing the same thing, and folks in our church were as well. And it was really beautiful to watch. I mean, people stopped, and what was most important got most important in that moment. And we stopped and we took care of each other, and we didn't fight for a few minutes, right? We just said, hey, you need help, and I'm going to be here to help you. And it was really cool to watch.
It really was. And I think it put a lot in perspective, too, because I think it was one of the first times where we were a little bit at the mercy of our elements. I mean, for the most part, like I know in Chicago and in the north, you're always seeing like these photos of cars stopped on the road because of freezing storms and blizzards. But that's not something we usually experience besides hurricanes and tornadoes, which are, you know, definitely have devastating impacts on communities here. We're pretty well disaster free. And so I was talking to a member from the Houston Galveston area yesterday, and he was like, you know, in Houston and Galveston, we're used to being like having federal declarations of disaster in our areas. We're used to like how to deploy water needs and necessities. And, you know, they were equipped to do that quickly. It doesn't mean they didn't still hurt, but you know, they were equipped to do that. And so it was definitely a learning lesson. I learned a lot about being a homeowner last week.
Yes.
How not good at the cold I am. But beyond that, we have to talk about how we got here, because things like this should not be happening anywhere really. But we have a power grid. ERCOT owns the power grid. I'm going to explain this like a 4-year-old because I'm not like a complete expert at this, but
We learned it last week.
yes, exactly. There's distribution of the different types of energy sources, and we rely on like a really diverse system of energy. So gas, coal, and then we also rely on renewable energy in a smaller capacity, which represents about 24% of our energy comes from wind, 19% from coal, 9% from nuclear. And 56 is natural gas, so that's the majority according to our articles. And then also, did I say wind? Wind and solar. So a lot, like we immediately saw what happened is 97% of our wind energy froze. 97% of how much it provides done. So we are only getting 3% energy from there. And then we had about 30% is the most recent statistic, but I've heard a few numbers. So if you guys know of our coal and gas energy unable to be distributed because generators froze. So the problem is ERCOT is a private entity running and in charge of the entire grid, which I always like to call a monopoly. So consumers can pay from different energy groups, but like you pretty much get what you get. And they were told to winterize and didn't. And there's no regulation of them. And so this is like a completely deregulated area. The state of Texas subsidized $7.2 billion into renewable energy. And then didn't regulate it, didn't really follow up. The lieutenant governor came out saying we were told it was winterized and prepared for this storm, but at the end of the day, they tried to pass reforms to regulate the industry about 10 years ago in 2011 after a really terrible storm. Nothing happened. And we should have been better equipped for one storm. So what ERCOT is saying is we had to do the rolling blackouts or we were going to see months of darkness. Like we are going to be completely blow out the grid for a blackout. And that is their big defense. I'm going to lawyer them and say we should never have been in that position to begin with. And so expending the money on winterizing, there should have been regulations in place. All that's going to be coming to a head in the hearings we're going to have in the upcoming months and weeks, really. Some of the hearings started today. We're going to go to a quick break in just a minute, but when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this dynamic with the energy companies, with ERCOT. What does this have to say about energy and the sources we rely on? What is the chatter that's out there? We're going to try to cover it all after this break. If you want to read anything about these articles that we're talking about or the issues we're talking about, you can go to pointofview.net. You can also follow us live and see our faces on Facebook. So Point of View on Radio on Facebook. Go ahead and click, follow, like. And if you want to call in, we'd love to hear from you and hear about your experience in the last week or your thoughts on renewable energy, because we are not experts. We are just talking about it. So you can call into 800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. And we'll be back after this short break.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today, and I've got Liberty around the table with me and Jonathan on the phone. We are just unpacking the Texas winter storm, snowpocalypse, all the cold things from last week. It's really nice. It's been 75 and 80, and we're thawed out. I mean, although people in Houston are still without water from what I'm hearing, so there's still, I think, a lot of remnants from the storm people are dealing with. But it would not be America if we didn't have a disaster happen that was immediately politicized. So,
Of course.
we're going to have to go there. I wish we didn't, but immediately we started seeing talking points coming out from really both sides. But I'll start with the sides I saw first, which was, AOC and some publications basically saying, Texas, this is what you get for being independent and not being more federally subsidized. And this is a great excuse for you to join the feds and get on some of our systems and Green New Deal. And then we saw, a lot of blame shifting for energy sources. Okay. And then on the other side, Governor Abbott came out saying, all of them failed, but renewable failed worse, essentially, and arguing that renewable was not quite. It's sustainable long term, but maybe not reliable. So I'm going to unpack this with some numbers because I think these are facts. These are not things we have to make up and debate. Now we have a horrible crisis to learn from, and we have a duty to learn from it. And so Texas spent $7.2 billion subsidizing renewable energy and solar and wind. So that now I'm being told by some members is probably not going to happen again after what happened because 97% of our wind energy failed. So I'll back up though, because a lot of people are breaking down like how many watts failed for each type of source and how much of what a percentage of our entire energy that accounted for. I don't think that's the right question to ask. I don't think it's, oh, well, they were 30% and coal was 50% and there were failures across the board. The question to ask is, to what degree did they fail? Because if one failed by 97% and the other failed by 30%, the 97% is far less reliable and should not probably be the majority bulk work of any renewable energy in the future or any energy in the future. So the 97% failure was wind. The wind froze. It's my understanding they can be winterized. And then I read somewhere that 30% of the coal and gas was unable to be distributed because of frozen generators. And so there's a distribution problem there. So when you're looking at reliability, to me, it's pretty clear that on the renewable side, if we had been like 100% or 80% reliant on wind, it would have been even worse. And so for me, that's the questions to ask. I don't know how you guys are grappling with this and all these statistics that are out there. You guys read the article that are posted on pointofview.net. Let's start with you, Jonathan, on the line. What are your thoughts and how do we move forward from here?
Well, I think it's really interesting, and I was reading several of the resources you sent, and then a bunch of others that kind of came out during and after the days of the storm. And if you don't live in Texas, and I've lived in Texas since the mid '90s and lived in several other parts of the country as well. My mom was raised in Chicago, so and she lives in Colorado now. So it's interesting to talk with her because she remembers the snowstorm in Chicago of 1967 when literally they had snow drifts of 28 feet.
Oh my goodness.
And they were still going to work. They only called school off once they literally couldn't see the door to the school anymore because the snow was so high. Wow. So if you live in other parts of the country where winter weather is a part of your reality, the Northwest, the Northeast, certain parts of Colorado, Utah, and places like that, these kinds of events you're more prepared for from an infrastructure standpoint. So in one sense, I can appreciate that Texas wasn't as prepared for that because it's so rare. I get that. But it does introduce an interesting point, Chelsey, that does intersect, though, with the constant, push and promotion and politicization of renewable energy. And it just highlights, again, a one-size-fits-all and I hate to say Green New Deal, but I'm just going to import that here because you mentioned AOC. Like what happened, I thought her comments were so interesting, just on the politics end of it real quick, because, just coming out from, I'm not trying to make fun, but like you're a representative of New York and you're making comments about weather in Texas. Like, if there was ever a great argument for federalism, like we're living it in real time, because your obligation to your constituency should be first as a congressman. And yet we have people in Congress that really get excited about states that they live thousands of miles away from. But that aside, I think if you try to put on this kind of one-size-fits-all Green New Deal mentality, it's going to always break down from state to state because the needs of the states and local communities are different. And so if you try to superimpose renewable energy paradigms into states that, frankly, either A, aren't going to thrive with it, B, can't afford it, or C, don't necessarily need it universally, I think you run into problems. And so what I hope happens is that Texas doesn't become subservient to a larger national discussion because how expensive coal is in Pennsylvania, that means we can't use it at all. Well, that's not necessarily the case. So I think it is going to head that way. I hope it doesn't, because in a lot of ways, I think sometimes we've just lost the ability in culture to say crazy weather events sometimes happen no matter how prepared we are. Mm-hmm. And you just sometimes have to deal with it. I lived in Florida for years. Hurricanes are coming, man. Like, you can prepare all you want. It's a byproduct of living on a peninsula near the equator. It's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So I hope it doesn't precipitate an unnecessary policy shift, but I fear that may be coming.
Well, it depends. Which policy shift do you think would be unnecessary? Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think you were kind of headed towards this a little bit, what you were saying earlier from the legality side of it. Unfortunately, sometimes I think that major, particularly weather events, become this onboard for people who subscribe much more to climate change doctrine, if you will. Mm-hmm. They become opportunities to say, well, see, we told you. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to say, like, okay, it snowed in Galveston, guys. Like, that's not necessarily.
We're laughing because that's our Caribbean beach town of Texas.
Right. I know, right? Like, that's Houston. That's Texas's claim to beach fame, so to speak. But I mean, it makes the point, though, right, that you can't just superimpose a larger global warming discussion because we had crazy wind chill for a week in Texas. Now, we do this 5, 6, 7 seasons in a row. Okay, mm-hmm. That's a different conversation. But when infrastructure becomes the sort of the tail that wags the philosophical dog about how we're going to approach the politics of the realities of growing energy needs, and then you turn it into, this is my opinion, and you turn it into, well, so therefore we need to import the climate change conversation to everything that happens. That can become irresponsible on multiple levels, mm-hmm. and it may not even contextually fit. So that's what I mean by, I hope we don't see unnecessary policy shifts, even in a place like Texas, that are predicated under a philosophy of, well, global warming must be this, so therefore we've got to do all these other things. And that's the predicate for the Green New Deal, right? Like, right. That's where the hinge that door swings on.
Right. I think if anything, what I'm hearing from leadership in Texas, but also from just fellow Texans, is we want to be more independent than ever. Mm-hmm. We want options. We want consumers. I mean, this is a great example. Libertarians, don't yell at me, but this is a great example of a failure of libertarianism, because we need some regulation to mm-hmm. completely deregulate something as important as our energy is unthinkable, but it happened, and now we need to learn and learn what is worth subsidizing in the billions and what is worth not. Do you have any thoughts on this, Liberty?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I think Jonathan made a lot of great points. And speaking of somebody who's not from Texas commenting on Texas, first of all, props where they're due. I know Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who we nickname AOC.
AOC, yes.
She did raise a lot of money for Texas, and so that's appreciated. But, commenting on our politics here when you're not from here and just clearly pushing, a very extreme Democratic political agenda is not as much appreciated.
But she did donate millions. I mean, she came to Texas.
Did, yes.
We have yet to see Biden care as much as she did.
Right. Frankly. So, yes, I appreciate that. But, speaking of ERCOT, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, I learned all this last week. Their board resigned. I know we were talking about over the break over this whole, crisis situation. And then I found out that the board members that resigned, they didn't even live in Texas. So again, we talked kind of about the monopoly that they had on the Texas power grid. And so I'm hoping that, a lot of Texans are waking up to the problem that we had of maybe not really being represented as Texans by the people who control our power, and that hopefully we can take, lessons from this and say, okay, well, we're going to do what's best for Texas now going forward and find those solutions.
I think that's such a great point. I mean, all of us are looking around saying, do we need to get generators? I mean, how can we be independent? Because we're in a pretty codependent world that we live in, just naturally by the nature of things. So thanks for listening to us. When we get back after this, we're going to wrap this up and move on and start talking a little bit about the GOP, what's in the future for the Republican Party, and what did we learn after the last election.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Chelsey Youman, your Millennial Roundtable host today, and we've been talking about the energy crisis, storm apocalypse that happened last week for Texans everywhere. But I'm going to shift now to some breaking Texas news because I'm really excited to see this bill filed. We saw a bill come out that Senator Paxton filed today and Representative Leach filed in the state of Texas called EMMA. It's called the Every Mother Matters Act. And I did work with these members behind the scenes on this bill. So I'm excited to see that it's filed today and it's officially on the books. It's a bipartisan bill that would basically say before women obtain an abortion, she would receive an offer of assistance from any group that's not affiliated. It's a third party group from an abortion provider that would basically say, what are the reasons you're seeking an abortion? Is there anything we can do to help alleviate your circumstances, help get you on your feet, and stabilize whatever issues you're going through? And that a lot of this is based on knowledge that we have about women who are seeking abortion, who are unemployed. Sometimes they already have children or are trouble feeding their current children. Some of them don't have safe housing. Some are victims of domestic violence. So this bill has a domestic violence screen, a human trafficking screen to ensure that women are in safe environments and are not victims of human trafficking. All of that is baked into the cake. I think it's a really incredible bill because it approaches abortion from a holistic care lens that says, let's see why women are seeking abortions and come alongside them and care for them long term. So I'm really excited to see this bill. It is bipartisan. So Senator Lucio is a Democrat in the Texas State Senate, and he's excited about this bill and signed on as a joint author, as did Senators Hughes and Campbell. So if you're in the state of Texas, be sure to look out for this bill. It was filed. It will hopefully get some hearings, a floor debate, and pass. But it is definitely a way to serve women and make sure that they have other options and better solutions besides abortion, and provide real alternatives to abortion. So I know I'm throwing this at you guys, but Liberty, what do you think about, my introduction of this bill and this concept?
That makes me really excited. I think that's, sounds like an excellent bill that hopefully everybody can get behind, because we do know from statistics that one of the main reasons that women seek abortions is because there are circumstances, in their life that they think that they will not be able to afford another child, or that they won't be able to care for another child. And I know, my church works a lot with vulnerable women and families in our community to try to help them out. And I just, in the past few months, I've come across a couple different women who were let go from their jobs while pregnant and single because their jobs didn't want to make accommodations for them while they were pregnant. So I just, there are a lot of reasons like that lead women to feel like they have no other options. And, the party that claims to be pro-women oftentimes says, well, the answer is abortion, and that's
right.
What's going to liberate women. But women's equality or liberation cannot depend on, we'll just kill your offspring and that's going to solve all your problems. That's not pro-woman. So I think a bill like this definitely is, because it says you're obviously in crisis. So how can we help you? How can we actually help you not just survive, but thrive and care for your family in the way that you want to do? So I think that's great.
Right. And it's completely voluntary. And the bill, by the way, allows for her to receive services like that. Sometimes it's as simple as signing up for insurance, connecting her to a doctor, but it allows for these services for up to 2 years. And so that's prenatal health care. It's postpartum health care, trying to get maternal mortality in the state of Texas decreased, because it is a big problem in the state of Texas is healthy pregnancies. And so all of that is really baked into the cake. But I really think that I'm excited about it, because the abortion debate is always, it seems so two-sided, and it always comes down to regulating abortion. But this is really thinking beyond that, and what I would call like the next frontier, which is that we've got to start looking at why 60,000 women a year seek abortion. That's a ton. And we just saw that the Planned Parenthood abortion statistics for last year just released. They've conducted over 8.6 million abortions, just Planned Parenthood alone, in total. But they had a historic year for the most abortions at 354,000 abortions. And those are, that's over 250,000 lives lost last year alone. And that's because we would say from our clinic model, we would know that we had an uptick in women reaching out to us with crisis pregnancies, because in light of COVID and joblessness on the rise, uncertainty drives up abortions. And so for me, this isn't surprising that in 2019 through 2020, that's the case. But we have to have an alternative for that besides abortion, and say, how can we create certainty and independence where there's uncertainty and dependence? What do you think about all that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think, I haven't read the language of the bill, but I think just in your describing it and explaining it. I think it's a great next step, like you said, and just the evolution of us understanding the pro-life narrative for so long, particularly amongst evangelicals and conservative Christians, and just people who just are opposed to abortion in general. The narrative, as y'all both know, is let's try to make not only abortion, take it out of the legal context with Roe v. Wade going away, but let's make it unthinkable. Mm-hmm. And that's been so much of the narrative for a long, long time. And, we've talked on here many times when I've been with y'all that one of the ministries that our church treasures the most is our pregnancy centers. And I know Liberty was talking about the various ways that her church and so many more like ours are getting involved in making this a priority, and it should be. But I think you're right, Chelsey. It's part of that next step in the evolution of saying, we're going to stay committed beyond just saying we want to help save babies, which is huge. It's fundamental. And I think you're right. The pandemic and the realities, the economic realities of the pandemic, I think in many ways, I've said this now several times in just conversations, and may have said it on here last time, but I think the thin veneer of culture really got pulled back during COVID. I mean, we're still in it, but when it was at its peak last year, I think you start seeing so much of the economic disparity revealed and how quickly the bottom can fall out for so many people. And so when you intersect that with hopelessness and economic uncertainty and all of those different things, it factors into those decisions that many women have to face. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to say, hey, no, there are better pathways, there are better options and alternatives, and we're going to make a commitment beyond the first decision, which is I'm going to choose life, and into the future of that baby and that family. I think it's huge. It's fundamental.
It is, and it's exciting to see that, hopefully the state of Texas will be leading out an initiative like this. It empowers women and it saves lives. So it's bipartisan. You think everyone can agree with this. When we're seeing on this report that Planned Parenthood put out, which you can look at pointofview.net, they reported receiving I got to find it again, but just $600 million through Medicaid, state-funded Medicaid programs, and the federal government and grants. And so what we have is a system of government in America. Now, of course, Texas did an incredible job fully defunding Planned Parenthood from Medicaid because of criminal activity that has been proven and is on the record. But what you have is infrastructure that's widely supporting Planned Parenthood. Even though it's not necessarily supporting directly the abortions they're providing, it enables them to keep the lights on, open more facilities, expand, hire more abortionists. Whereas really we would like to see a counter to that and see government and infrastructure put more time and energy into stabilizing families, stabilizing women's health, saving children. If we build similar infrastructure, can you imagine how many lives would be changed? And for the women and the children, the goal is ultimately to have the babies being able to be connected with their pediatricians when they're born. And, in some communities where women don't always know the exact next steps when they're pregnant, to have someone come alongside them and say, here's how you sign up for Medicaid. Let me help you get insurance. Here's how we can connect you with providers in your network. All of that is very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. And it's helpful to anyone who's pregnant because a lot of that's confusing and difficult to navigate. But I'm excited to see Senator Paxton and Representative Leach lead out on this, to sponsor this bill. It's called the Every Mother Matters Act. You can go to everymothermatters.com to learn more about it. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. Stay tuned.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Thank you for joining us today on Point of View is Millennial Roundtable, and I'm your host, Chelsey Youman. I have with me today Liberty McArtor. She's a freelance writer and pretty much a brainiac. I just love Liberty's perspective. Thank you for joining us today, Liberty.
I don't know if I'm a brainiac, but I'm glad to be here. I always enjoy discussing these topics.
She brings out the greatest points of view. And we also have today joining us online is Jonathan Teague. He's the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. Jonathan, we love having you. Thanks for coming back.
Oh, it's great to be with y'all. I would agree with you. Liberty is crazy smart. I really appreciate y'all's insights in this fun conversation.
Well, thank you. And then finally, our other millennial is Richard Lim. He's joining us. He's our historian and also produces and is the voice of This American President podcast, which you should all go download right now. Richard Lim, thanks for joining us on the phone.
Always good to be here.
We have a great show lined up today. We're going to start talking about the future of the GOP and the Republican Party because some really interesting data was released about the past elections. And I know if you're like me and, I might be a Republican and that's surprise to none of our listeners. But, your Republicans are saying, what's the future of our party going to look like? Where do we go from here? Things ended pretty chaotically for the Republicans and it's pretty factioned and how are we going to coalesce? What's it going to look like in 4 years? Well, we have a little bit of information coming out about that. So if you want to hear about our topics today, you can go to pointofview.net, look at our topics, or listen live to us on Facebook, Point of View Radio. You can go to Facebook, comment. We'll try to get to your questions if you ask any there. And then a little bit later on the show, we're also going to turn to the Equality Act that Congress, we call it the so-called Equality Act, that Congress is looking at in the House and Senate. Ryan Anderson had a really compelling piece in National Review analyzing that. And of course, I'll put my legal hat on as we talk about that. And then finally, in our last hour of the show, we'll turn to Planned Parenthood's abortion statistics and rates, a breaking new bill that was filed in Texas. And then we'll probably unpack and unfreeze and unthaw the Texas snowstorm from last year, which, really impacted most of us on the phone, except for Richard, who's usually in D.C. and where it's extra cold. But this time he's in sunny California. So lucky Richard.
I was in California. Now I'm in D.C. So
okay.
My life isn't as good as it could be, but it's not bad.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're back in D.C., Richard, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot to tell us about the Republicans. So let's break down what news has come out this week. There's been a few things. We're going to start in chronological order. So former President Trump announced that he will be, I think, making a run for it again in 2024, and that he thinks he is pretty much a shoo-in for being the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. And then a poll was released that said half of Republicans would be supportive of that. And so this is out of the Hill. They said that most Republicans say that 27% say that they would be undecided, but almost 50% said that they would actually leave the Republican Party if it wasn't Trump. And so pretty united there. And then a couple other statistics I want to make sure to highlight to everyone before we start our discussion today is that they did a study on really shifting demographics among the Republican Party and the GOP. And it was very, very telling. I got really excited seeing some of this because in historic number, blue collar voters voted in droves for President Trump in November of last year, as did minority voters. And so there was a 12-point increase in blue collar workers voting for President Trump, which has traditionally been a demographic that has always been associated with the Democrat Party, and is something the Democrat Party has usually worked for. And I think this might have economic implications for us, but I think that trade is important. But it was also among Hispanic voters, and this is particularly true in Texas, but there was a 36% increase in Hispanic voters voting for the Republican Party. Now, I think it's important to know, at least in Texas, a lot of the Hispanic demographic is Catholic, so they're very aligned on the conservative social issues, which these articles did not discuss, but I always think is important to note. So they socially tend to be more conservative. And then in Texas, there was also a large concern for the oil and gas industry. So a lot of Hispanic workers in the oil and gas industry were worried about Biden's fallout for that industry for them. But this is kind of historic to see minority groups and blue collar workers voting in the GOP. Do we think it's permanent? Do we think it's not? Richard, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I think there's something to note here. And as you mentioned, I have a podcast that focuses on history, so I'm always trying to look at the historical perspective. And what Trump is doing is really reversing something that has been just such a long-standing feature of American politics. I mean, this predates FDR. For so long, basically from the late 19th century on, the idea was that the Republican Party was the party of business, and the Democratic Party was the party of farmers and the working class. And FDR really solidified that during his presidency, and a few Republicans have been able to make dents in that. Famously, there were Reagan Democrats, people who were union members in the Midwest that voted for Democrats usually, but they bolted for Reagan. But you didn't hear as much about them when the Bushes were president. And then suddenly you have this major shift. And I think Donald Trump is somebody that historically, at least at this point, he's a one-term president, but his influence could be outsized because he could be creating what is called a realignment. And that's something that rarely happens. Historians debate when the last realignment happened. Some say it hadn't happened since 1932, but this is a very big trend. And the fact that it's happening across different races shows that this is a coalition that goes just beyond the kind of the white collar folks of the blue wall in the upper Midwest. This is a broader long-term trend of people who look at the woke left and say, these people don't represent me.
Very interesting. Let me ask you a follow-up question about that. So do you think with your historic background, is the transition of these types of groups, is it typically permanent, or are we looking at a Trump phenomenon, a 2020 blip? Things will realign back to what we would have called the status quo?
Well, I think that part of that depends on the political skill of the people in charge. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the most politically effective presidents. There's a reason why he won 4 straight presidential elections, and his coalition lasted a very long time. President Reagan obviously was a very talented politician, and he was a great president. But I think even he has had to contend with, Reagan Democrats that eventually ended up going back to the Democratic Party. I think for the Republicans, it really is up to how responsive they are to people that voted for Trump. And I think, quite frankly, Trump has had a very high approval rating among Republicans. The GOP establishment, not so much. And so it really depends on how the GOP are.
Very interesting. We're going to go to one of those breaks. When we get back, Richard, I'd love to continue to hear from you on this issue, and Jonathan as well. Is the shift permanent? We don't know.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us after the break. We've been speaking with Richard Lim on the phone, and he's actually giving us such an interesting historical perspective of party shifts and realignment, because we're seeing one now, but potentially, hopefully, a permanent one for the Republican Party, in that record numbers of blue collar voters and minority voters crossed over and voted for President Trump in November. And so we're unpacking this now. Richard, you were talking about really whether or not this becomes a permanent trend is going to be up to kind of the leaders that are in charge. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to your comments there?
Yeah, I think that it's important, to realize now there are a lot of people in the so-called establishment of the Republican Party and just people in Washington. I mean, I see this all the time that look at, blue-collar Americans, and they either are ignorant of them or they dismiss them. But I think they haven't woken up to the fact that they have legitimate grievances, and if they don't answer those grievances, they fuel support for Trump. And so that's going to be an issue that won't go away for sure.
That's so important. It actually reminds me of what, Liberty, you were speaking to over the break. You were saying we have to ask the question, the why. Why are these groups breaking from the traditional voting habits that some of them have? We're talking 13% here, but those are swing voters now, and we know you win elections with swing voters. So, Liberty, how would you unpack the why and the importance of understanding these voters and their needs?
Well, in 2016 or 2015, when Trump announced his run for in the Republican primaries, he's not he wasn't and is still not the traditional kind of Republican candidate or conservative champion. So I think a lot of conservatives and Republicans were initially very suspicious of that. But if you look at the people who initially latched on to him, even before he became the party candidate, it was a lot of blue collar workers. And I think that for so long they had been ignored by Democrats, by elites in Washington, D.C., overlooked as flyover country, like Richard said, dismissed. And they saw Trump as somebody who would, give them a voice. And I think, we can critique his combativeness and his rhetoric and leadership style, but I think for people who had been so frustrated for so long that they were being ignored, that was actually appealing because they were like, okay, he's actually going to go to bat for us. And I think in one of the articles you posted on pointofview.net from The Hill talking about how 46% of Republicans say they would leave the GOP to join a Trump-led party. There was a really interesting quote in there from a woman who was a small business owner from Milwaukee, so kind of talking about those blue-collar workers. She said, "We feel like Republicans don't fight enough for us, and we see Donald Trump fighting for as hard as he can every single day," and thinks that the establishment Republicans just agree with establishment Democrats all the time. And so that's the perception. And so I think you have to, we can be critical of Trump and his style, and, we can think about all that and talk about all that, and we should. But like Richard said, if we ignore the underlying complaints of these people who voted for Trump and the blue-collar workers who are starting to support his version of the Republican Party, we're not going to be successful because they do have legitimate complaints, and we need to address those.
I love what you're saying. So what I'm hearing is I think we can unpack this so that we are going to oversimplify this. There's a lot of analysis, I think, but, political pundits will put into this. But I think I'm going to say there's three categories. Of course, we have a Republican base, and I'll now call 46% of Republicans, I would call a large demographic of the base. And so 46 would be willing to leave the GOP to join Trump. And so what we have is Trump is a post ideologue. So he has been classified as someone who doesn't fit into the traditional Republican Party platforms. He kind of goes at things his own way. But in general, that's a pretty significant part of the base that the establishment can't ignore next election cycle. They can only win if they engage their base. And so thinking through what was it about Trump, which is what you were saying and alluding to, that drew such loyalty and people wanting someone who's going to fight and stand up for their core values, which on paper Trump did as a very strong conservative. But the other two categories, I would say for the blue collar workers, is Trump's economics really worked. There were record, and I guess for minorities, it was record numbers of low unemployment rates during his tenure, record highs of the stock market being reached. His economic policies worked. So maybe that had an impact here on the blue collar workers. And then the third category being minority voters, typically a lot of them do have conservative social values. And so the left is very extreme on their social issues, more than they've ever been, might be looking at that and be a little freaked out. Jonathan, what are you making of all of this? Jonathan, you there? Well, I don't know where Jonathan went.
Sorry.
Oh, there he is.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, no, I think that the plot's only going to thicken for the next 3 years, right? And so that's an eternity in politics in a lot of ways. But I think what you are seeing President Trump say is, he's staying engaged. So how much of this is political posturing, and how serious is he about it? We'll see. Maybe he'll give us more at CPAC in a few weeks, since it looks like he's going to speak there. That's a big signal. So I think that now you should take him at his word. And he probably also knows the same numbers that we're talking about, and more so, and the fact that he realizes that there is a massive populist groundswell that remembers, a couple months ago when he was president, if we can all remember, and what came with that, and the positives. And there were, from a conservative agenda, there were a lot. We'll see how those flesh out and the implications from them in the coming months. We'll see what happens in 2022 with the midterms. A lot can happen, but I would be fascinated, to hear Richard's perspective. How much of this looks and maybe feels like, I think it was the election of 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt came back with the Bull Moose Party. I mean, are there sort of signals to that? And what if, is a third party coming? What implications are from there? And to Liberty's point, what is the Republican base now? What is it really? Mm-hmm. And who is it? And what is their mind? I think all of that is on the table now. And so it's a little bit like 2015, but now because of who President Trump is and what we know about him, is he really laying the gauntlet? Like, if he does, I mean, all signs point that then that's who he's going to run in 24. And so, will the party get behind him? Jim Jordan made a statement on Twitter yesterday. Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. Well, how many people really agree with that? So I think it makes for a lot of interesting political theater. And will that be true 2-3 years from now? I think that'll remain to be seen.
Yes. Well, Richard, we have a couple minutes, so let's hear from you on those questions about the third party breakout. And I mean, Jonathan kicked it all the way back to 1912. So I wasn't around then. Jonathan or Richard, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's a very apt description because you have two guys that, they were Republicans, but they didn't really sit well with the Republican Party. And they had the clout, Teddy Roosevelt had the clout to do a third-party run. But if there's one thing to note about that is that he lost the race. Woodrow Wilson became president, one of the most liberal presidents. And then the Republican Party reverted back to conservatism when Teddy Roosevelt died in we had the Harding-Coolidge administration of the 20s. So it's something that has yet to be seen, whether the party will revert back to what it was before Trump. History says it's possible.
Well, that's so interesting. One last fact I'll throw out before our break, and we're going to move on to the Equality Act when we get back. But before then, just to note that 19 million more voters voted for President Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. That's the third highest increase an incumbent has ever had. So that's, I think, historical and noteworthy in and of itself. But to say there seems to be a lot of growth in the Republican Party, and even in spite of the actual election result, which is highly still contested. But regardless of that result, I mean, I think it's safe to say that Republicans saw an increase in millions and millions of voters. And that's something that I certainly hope that you're right, Richard, that the leadership will take note of and continue outreach programs, continue to sign up voters, and to not necessarily realign the Republican Party, because I think the Republican conservative values are strong and speak for themselves, and their policies reaped benefits for blue collar workers and the economy as a whole. But it will be interesting to see how much, they're going to be catered to. It's always that tension between your base and the swing voter, and how much or how little to pick up your party platforms in the middle. So we'll be sure to follow President Trump, or former President Trump, as he speaks in the upcoming weeks and see what that's about. Maybe he'll find a new platform to be able to speak from, because we know he's been shut down on Twitter. So it's been really quiet. We have not heard from him since the riot issue. But when we get back, we are going to turn to the Equality Act, which Congress is considering. And Ryan Anderson had a really well-written article on National Review that we'll make sure to cover. You can go to pointofview.net to read any of our articles or topics today. But stay tuned after the break. There's more to come.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for Point of View's Millennial Roundtable, where we're talking about all of our current events and issues from a millennial perspective. And I'm surrounded by quite a few brilliant millennials today. On the line, we've got Richard Lim and Jonathan Teague. And then in studio, we have Liberty McArtor. And we've been unpacking some really important demographic shifts in the Republican vote makeup that came out this week. Talked about our projections for the future of the Republican Party. So go back and listen last hour if you missed that. But now we're going to turn to an act that we have heard of before, but it's actually going to be put to a House vote as soon as next week. So it's a really important act to highlight. It's called the Equality Act. It's before Congress. As background, you know, Democrats now control the House and the Senate. Well, it's 50-50 in the Senate, but Vice President Harris is the deciding vote. And so that would be enough to get them a majority in the Senate, if not for the filibuster. And so to overcome a filibuster in the Senate to pass this act, you would need 60 votes or 10 Republicans to vote for the act, which is unlikely, but possible. So what is the Equality Act? Well, the Equality Act would amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prevents discrimination on the basis of race and sex, to include and broaden those categories to sexual orientation and gender identity, creating them protected classes under federal law. But the implications of this law are really vast and really extreme. I mean, they're saying that it's in the name of preventing discrimination, but the act says that no one can object to doing things in the healthcare industry, like providing abortions or transgendered surgeries, without being able to be sued for discrimination. There's no accountability for any religious protection. So this overrides First Amendment religious conscience protections that would maybe say, for instance, if you're a pastor and you have a biblical view on marriage being between one man and one woman, and you ask to have a religious exemption from doing a wedding between a same-sex couple, that pastor could be sued and not have religious defenses that he would traditionally have had prior to this law in place. There's a whole host of things packed into this law. I'm going to unpack a few of them and see which you guys want to discuss. But they redefined the term sex to include pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions for the purposes of discrimination. And what this means is any individual who's a doctor providing gynecological care who does not provide abortion can be sued for discrimination. That's part of sex discrimination now. And so now all doctors, if you provide any reproductive health care services, have to include abortion. If you don't provide abortions, you're not allowed to be eligible for federal funds, grants, or programs to serve women. So groups like Human Coalition, where I work, could not be eligible for funds or grants just to come alongside women in their pregnancies and serve them because they don't promote abortion. They promote life. So what I think this bill really does is enact, I think, discrimination against people who have divergent views, different views, whether that's on pregnancy or marriage or gender. There's really no differences here. And they also include, by the way, that men would be able to enter women's facilities. So any housing facilities, Safeway houses, bathrooms, locker rooms, all of that is on the table here. So it's really, I think, devastating, and it's taxpayer funded. So when you're thinking of, okay, how does this translate into abortion being now promoted through the federal government, they're trying to chip away a little bit at the Hyde Amendment here in a backhanded way, which means taxpayer funded abortion. So this is really widespread. There's a lot to unpack here, but Liberty, I'll start with you. What stood out to you about this bill and its potential ramifications for Americans?
Well, there were a couple of things, particularly that I was thinking about while I was reading about this. First of all, calling it pregnancy discrimination to not provide an abortion based on your beliefs. Or in the last hour, we were talking about the issue of the issues women face and actual pregnancy discrimination that many women face, losing their jobs because of, they're pregnant and things like that. Those are the issues that anybody who actually cares about women and their families should be focusing on to to really make the world a better place for them, to make our country, a safe place for a woman to have a pregnancy and get the support she needs and care for her family. And so it's so hypocritical to see Democrats pushing this extreme agenda saying, oh, we are going to fight pregnancy discrimination, I put that in quotes, by forcing all doctors to perform abortions, even if it goes against their beliefs. So that's really upsetting, on that front, because that's not what women actually need. Another thing to note is that, this is going to really threaten religious freedom, but not just for conservative Christians. A lot of the minorities who typically vote Democrat have more conservative social views, and not just Christian groups. You have Muslims and Orthodox Jews and Mormons and different religious groups who hold to a traditional view on sexuality and gender. So, do we really want to say that any Christian school, any Catholic school, any Muslim school, or, any kind of religious faith-based organization is not going to be able to operate according to their beliefs due to this bill? That's not equality. That's not religious freedom for anybody. So, those are a few of the things that really stuck out to me, I think, is problematic.
Absolutely. Richard, did you agree with all of that, or did you have any additional things you want to add?
Yeah, I think that things like these, first of all, it's obviously the Democrats, this isn't the first time that they've tried to overturn religious liberty in this country. But I think that people a lot of times don't really understand, because moral relativism is basically the religion right now of a great deal of the country. And so they don't realize how radical this is. I mean, for so long in this country, we've had protections for religious liberty for people who are conscientious objectors, whose religions basically teach pacifism against going to war. And so we've provided that because we've had a let live policy. And unfortunately, yes, you see the far left that's just chipping away at that because they're imposing their moral secular views on everyone else. And so it's very dangerous. And once again, it's called the Equality Act. It sounds innocuous, but that's what Democrats have done. And I think Joe Biden wants to have, just like a typical Democratic president, wants to have some grandiose achievements to put on his progressive resume. But, natural rights be darned. This is what they're pushing for.
Right. And, what's so disappointing to me, Richard, is that I view this as largely unnecessary. We are not seeing any rampant discrimination like what they're talking about. Healthcare is widely accessible to individuals. They can go get sex reassignment surgery. It's widely accessible as it is. Abortions are so widely accessible. They had historic high records of abortions last year. So we're not seeing like a lack of healthcare for people. They call it healthcare. We would not categorize any of that as healthcare, but it's accessible. These services are accessible to people who want them. But this bill would force people who do not want to participate in sex reassignment surgeries or participate in those things on moral grounds or religious grounds. It's required and mandated participation. And beyond that, it's government funded participation. And so it's just really extreme. I can't overstate that enough. Like, we're talking taxpayer funding of abortion. And expansion through the states of it for it. And because think through your insurance policies, which are not currently required to fund abortion, but they will be under this act. Insurance policies, if they provide any gynecological care, would have to also provide and pay for abortion. Same with Medicaid. And so that's really historic. We've got a minute left before break, but I really want to hear from you, Jonathan. What stood out about the Equality Act to you?
The vast majority of it, but that being said,
all of it.
I think, right, like what Richard said, the implication here is not equality. It's about re-engineering what we define the term to mean, and the superimposing of a worldview that's far beyond what we would even put in the boundary lines of evangelicalism, and then backdoor legislating it. It's just, I know we're going to talk more about it as the show goes on, but it's universally bad on innumerable levels. And I'll just say this in 10 seconds, Chelsey. What's worse about it is what essentially is happening, to come to what you just said, is we're taking what is wildly non-essential, and then we're subsidizing on the federal level and then forcing you to call it essential. And government intrusion deluxe. So So it's bad. So.
It is bad. And, it's what I keep coming back to is it's just specifically targeting the demographic that wants to say, hey, you do you. You're already able to get married and participate in women's sports and do all the things wherever you want, get abortion. But we, based on our religious principles, cannot participate or facilitate that activity. But this targets that individual because that's really the only individual that's going to be impacted by this is the doctor who says, I think hormone therapy for teenagers is unethical. And there are a whole host of doctors that think that is the case, but now they're going to be susceptible to liability for all that. So when we get back, we're going to continue to talk about the Equality Act and unpack it from a millennial perspective here. Stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. We'll talk to you soon.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, thank you for joining us. You can go to pointofview.net to see any of the articles that we've been talking about posted there, or follow us on Point of View Radio on Facebook. We'd love for you to be able to tune in and comment and see what all we've been discussing. We talked about the history and potential future, actually, of the GOP party. So thankful to Richard, who's on the line, to give us a robust history on that. But right now we shifted gears and we're talking about the Equality Act. And I just want to give Jonathan the opportunity, because he is a pastor. And I do think that the Equality Act and some of the provisions in it will greatly impact him, because it basically overrides religious liberty interests, First Amendment defenses from participating in anything involving gender identity, sexual orientation, and abortions, which are categorized as sex for the purposes of the act. So, Jonathan, what are your thoughts as a church or as a pastor? How would you guys respond to something like this? And how do you think this will impact you in your ministry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a very relevant question, not only for churches, but also Christian colleges and universities, seminaries, private schools, et cetera. And I think the response is going to be predicated on how everything actually gets filed. Does it actually get passed? My gosh, will it be attached to the next stimulus bill? I mean, so many different debates that are happening. So some of the response probably needs to be measured in regard to how it actually is rolled out. But if you want to take a worst case scenario perspective, as I understand it, and I'm still reading more on it and trying to gain a lot more perspective, this was talked about in the campaign. President Biden obviously, he stumped on it to one degree or another as he was preparing for the election. So he's following through, and I think Richard, said earlier, it is a key plank in a progressive agenda. And I know Liberty spoke to this as well, and it's exactly right. So I think in terms of churches in particular, I mean, gospel-minded churches essentially don't get told by the state what to do. That's not just a Baptist distinctive. That's been a universally Christian distinctive for 2,000 years. So, in America, I would hope and pray that we don't get to a place where the government is, mandating certain hiring practices or, my goodness, content from the pulpit and things like that. You boil it all down. If that day comes, well, then, we'll become, I think, far more familiar with what some of our brothers and sisters around the world have to navigate on a weekly basis in places like China and other places where you go underground and you become a little bit more militant and the gospel spreads like crazy. So who knows? But on its face, Chelsey, I think it really runs aground what are the formative principles of the American experience, which is that we're here for religious liberty and freedom. We're here so that our expression of faith is not unfettered, particularly in the public square. And when you import ideologies that really run over and against a Christian worldview on purpose, I think, very intentionally, very strategically, with an aim towards trying to strip away the ability to express religious liberty, which I think is the end goal of all of this, then I think it's un-American, to be very honest. So I hope we don't get there. If we do, I think churches, if need be, fight it legally where they can. And I think gospel-minded churches will push back on it. And if there's fallout, there's fallout. But in every situation, we've seen, my friend Shane Pruitt would be saying this right now if he was here, in every situation where there's been persecution, and we throw that word around too much, but it's a real word, the gospel's always spread. So if that's where it's headed and that's what comes, then we'll keep preaching. But in the short run, it could become very complicated for churches to be able to hire, stand on faith and practice, theological statements and things like that. So it'll come at a cost if it comes through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Supreme Court, I always go back to, the Supreme Court has historically, thanks to the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts that have been passed, have always really strongly protected churches in these arenas. And it will be curious if Congress does pass this law, like how will the Supreme Court put these two things together, the protections of hundreds of history of constitutional protections and First Amendment speech protections, because a lot of this does result in speech prohibitions. How do they put that together with this law, the Equality Act? So, Richard, what are your thoughts on that? And then I'd love to hear also what your thoughts are on really the possibility of this passing, if any, through the Senate.
Right. Well, first of all, just wanted to make clear, obviously I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, so I can't necessarily speak to that in particular. But I think it's one of those issues that it's something that Christians have to oppose right now. But at the same time, it's also something, if we want to really respond to it, it's something that we need to make clear as well to fellow Christians. And the problem is that I found that, unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion within the church about this particular issue, and especially for millennials in particular, that kind of fall for the rhetoric that, this is just equality, and the government's role is to ensure equality among all Americans. And I think there's kind of a long game that needs to be played, because things like this happened because the liberals took over academia. And so students across the country, including Christians, have basically been indoctrinated in that sense. And I think when you look at what President Biden is doing, he's doing what Obama did very well, is that he's masquerading in the kind of these American terms, right? Equality, things like that. And what they're actually doing is very un-American. And so I think as Christians, we preach the gospel, but we also have to think strategically about how to respond to that in order to win back the culture and win back hearts and minds.
You know, that's such a good point, too, because I think it is millennials do grapple with this issue. I mean, we lost on the culture side of this, which I think is where the church could have probably leaned in a winsome way and taught more about this. But ultimately, millennials have had a hard time grappling with these issues, and as we entered our professional careers, saw 2015 Obergefell decided. Liberty, what are your thoughts on that? You worked at First Liberty Institute, I know, during that period.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Richard brought up a good point about millennials and kind of being confused on this issue. First of all, it's important to note that there are more people who identify as LGBTQ among millennials and Gen Z than any other generation. And so people in our generation are very, very likely to have coworkers or friends even, or family members who identify as LGBTQ in some way. And so and millennials are also very compassionate. And so that's where a lot of this confusion comes from, is, well, we don't want anyone to actually face true discrimination or be mistreated in the United States. And so we think, well, in order to be tolerant or supportive of people that we love, even if we may not agree with their lifestyle, we need to support this. But this is not true tolerance. As we've, said multiple times during this hour, this is forcing somebody who believes a certain thing about sexuality or gender or abortion because of their faith to participate actively in something that goes against their morals or their beliefs. So we can love well, and we can fight against true discrimination and mistreatment or bullying of people without and still stand firmly by our beliefs and what we believe the Bible says. And so I think that's what we really have to emphasize to our peers and in the church. And I love to read, so I'll plug a book. Uncommon Ground is a book that came out last year. It was edited by Tim Keller. Has a lot of Christians talking about what does it truly mean to engage the culture lovingly while standing firm on our beliefs. And so I think it's relevant to this topic.
Great. I love that plug. And then before we end our hour, Richard, go ahead because you're hopping offline, but I would love for our listeners to be able to know what you do and where they can follow you.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I have a podcast. It's called This American President. And basically, I was always that kid that I would study presidents at home. And while everyone was watching sports, I did that too. But I also loved reading about presidents. And so I was a nerd then, and I'm still a nerd now, reading about presidents, loving to tell stories that people have never learned about America's president. So feel free to check it out, thisamericanpresident.com.
Well, thank you for joining us, Richard. We love having you as always. And we're going to one of those quick breaks, but stay tuned. More topics to come.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the show. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we have a great show lined up. We've already talked about so many things, the potential future of the GOP party, the Equality Act, but we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk about some news that Planned Parenthood released this week about their statistics for last year, some new trends of bills we're seeing filed that are exciting on the abortion front to help alleviate issues for women. And then we are going to talk about snowpocalypse, the winter storm, whatever you've heard it called in Texas, which definitely was a historical and devastating week for many Texans based on everything they endured last week. But before we get there, let's introduce our guests. So we have around the table today, we've got Liberty McArtor. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Liberty.
Well, thanks for having me back, Chelsey. I'm a freelance writer here in North Texas. I do some writing for Point of View as well as First Liberty Institute, which Chelsey and I both have worked there in the past.
Yeah.
So, and then some other freelance writing around the web. My website is libertymccarter.com if you want to check any of that out.
Maybe she'll do some writing for you. We also have Ben Courson with Hope Generation on the line. Ben, you're also a writer, but go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, Chelsey, thank you so much for having me again. I had so much fun last time at the Millennial Roundtable. So I founded Hope Generation, which is a TV show that airs on 180 countries and also a radio show on 530 stations. So I'm also really excited to be a millennial voice of this generation, and particularly a voice of hope in a generation that's really racked by and marked by despair. So I'm excited for today.
Well, we are so glad to have your voice, because there's a lot we were talking about with some members earlier this week. I was saying, we just need a break. And they were like, everybody needs a break right now. And Ben, that's so exciting to hear your hopeful tone and voice. And I know your perspective that you're going to bring. Last but definitely not least, we have Jonathan Teague on the line. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, Chelsey and Liberty and Ben. It's good to be with you guys. Yeah, I'm one of the ministers at Preston Baptist Church and been a pastor for about 20 years, and just recently finished my doctor's degree, kind of writing and talking about discipleship of millennials, and just recently took on a new role at our church as well and leading our residency program, which is kind of shepherding and guiding young men and women with a call to ministry who are serving in short-term capacities in our church. So, yeah, super passionate about these cultures. This is a great conversation we're having today.
I know it's been quite the conversation. We're going to talk now about Planned Parenthood. They released their annual report. They released every single year, and basically talk about the types of services they provided. And it's always, honestly, a devastating read. I work for Human Coalition Action. I'm the Texas State Director. So I work on pro-life legislation and legislation that protects women and their families and try to help them get services they need so that they ultimately choose life and have healthy lives. But when I read this report, it is devastating, but I think it's something we have to talk about. I think as a culture, we have to continue to talk about abortion on its terms, deal with it for the reality it is instead of the euphemisms we hear on the left. The abortion is the ending of a human life in the womb. And Planned Parenthood did that in actual historical record numbers last year. Over 354,000 1,000 children, their lives were ended in the womb because of abortion last year. It's a record number, but not necessarily surprising. And that's because at Human Coalition, we serve women who are actively seeking abortion, and then ultimately, intervene in that process, help come alongside her, stabilize her circumstances, and hope she chooses life, right? So clinic and resource work for women. But the women that we're serving in this demographic, uncertainty drives up their decisions to have abortions. Unemployment drives up abortion rates. And we faced one of the most uncertain years, especially in millennials' lives ever in the last year. And so it's no surprise in a COVID world where unemployment is on the rise that we saw these numbers increase out of Planned Parenthood. They're still saying that abortion services are only 3% of their services, but we know they count everything from everything that a woman could want, from a handkerchief for sneezing is counted as a service. So that's kind of a number that they've used to debunk. But what's interesting is I think a lot of conservatives know this, but I am going to get into a little bit of detail here. We know that President Trump defunded about between $60 and $70 million of federal funds to abortion providers, Planned Parenthood, but they're still receiving $600 million in taxpayer dollars. Those don't yet directly go towards abortions, but it's through Medicaid billing at the state level. So they bill Medicaid and receive $600 million. And even though they were short $60 million in the last year, they were still able to have tons of abortion. So abortion is really accessible, really rampant. And unfortunately, we're looking at a Biden administration that is looking just to expand that funding and those models. So, Ben, I want to start with you, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this and this report that I put out. Our listeners can read it on pointofview.net. But, Ben, what were your initial thoughts about all of this?
Yeah, so when I look at the scriptures, when it comes to life in the womb, I'm just going to share some scriptures offhand that I think really speak to that issue. So, for example, it says that when Mary approached Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was carrying John the Baptist, who was 6 months before Jesus, it said that John the Baptist leapt within the womb. So you actually see John the Baptist rejoicing while in his mother's womb. Then again, you see in the book of Jeremiah, the first chapter, Jeremiah said, God, I cannot speak, for behold, I am a youth. And the Lord said, do not say I am a youth. I have called you to preach to the nations since you were in your mother's womb. Then again, we see in Psalm 139 that it says, the psalmist declares that I was carefully knit together in my mother's womb. And then one more passage, it says in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. So the scripture does talk about God's intentionality and crafty design of a baby, even in the mother's womb, which I think really kind of sheds some important scriptural and ancient wisdom light on what's happening today.
Well, I love that you're saying that and drawing attention to that. And Jonathan, you're a member of Prestonwood has a pregnancy center, is what I'm trying to say, and you're a pastor at Prestonwood. So go ahead and tell us, in lockstep with what Ben just said, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ben said that so well, as he always does, and I think that he and I would be like-minded in just saying, kind of going back to piggybacking on our last conversation before the break, Chelsey, about how do young adults, millennials and Gen Z now, in the church and around the church, so, young people who might not be affected by or participating in the ministries of a local church, and maybe so as a result, not drawing conclusions through a biblical worldview. How do we shape this narrative as it relates to life? And I think Ben did an excellent job of unpacking very quickly just a few instances of the hundreds of different times and ways that the scripture points to the fact that God is the author of life. He is the creator of life, and he values life. So I think it would not be in any way an understatement to say that so much of the Christian worldview is predicated on an understanding that life matters, and that God has, for lack of a better term, engineered life through his creative design. And so I think when you begin and end with that core belief, that core conviction, that core value, and I think, Liberty, you kind of started to avail to this a little bit earlier, it changes the nature of the conversation, because whether the words are equality or rights or, various terms, that changes the conversation.
That's so right. Well, stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Science is headed into uncharted territory. That's why we need a reliable science guide to navigate our journey. Dr. Michael Gillen provides that guidance in his book, The End of Life as We Know It. For years, he was an Emmy award-winning science correspondent for ABC News. He was on my radio program to talk about the book and his truth tour. He addresses 4 areas of concern: the web, the robot, the spy, and the Frankenstein. He talks about the incredible benefits we all receive from the World Wide Web. The information superhighway has lots of lanes to important information, but it also has many dark back alleys. He cites one headline that reminds us that sometimes the internet makes us monsters. In his section on robots and artificial intelligence, he once again explains how we have been the beneficiaries of machines that do routine manual labor and free us up from dangerous activities. But he also reminds us that robots are able to do more than merely put bolts on an assembly line and will take away many of our jobs. The section on spy reminds us how our privacy is going away. As one commentator put it, you have zero privacy, get over it. And before you merely brush that off, consider what it is like to live in China, where cameras and facial recognition keep track of you every single day. His last section reminds us of all the significant benefits we enjoy from science and genetic engineering. Treating and curing genetic disease is admirable, but scientists can now play God by mixing and matching genetic material. Good intentions can quickly morph into dangerous outcomes. I think his book is a good reminder why we need more Christians in the science fields in order to bring ethics and wisdom as science heads into uncharted territory. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, thanks for joining us today for the Millennial Roundtable. We've been talking about Planned Parenthood's historical record number of abortions that happened in the last year. And I wanted to hear from Liberty on your thoughts on that. We've also been talking about the biblical Christian worldview for life, that life is good, that God orders our steps, has plans and purpose for us, and that because of that, humans have inherent dignity. And so when we read things like this, it should be devastating, and we should be motivated to act and to say, what can we do to defend and support life? Liberty, what were your thoughts as you read the report?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say I loved hearing Ben kind of give us that crash course in what the Bible talks about, about life in the womb. I'm actually about 5 months pregnant right now. So as he was saying that, my little boy is like literally jumping around. And so it's just an amazing miracle to, the way that God creates life. And so it is tragic, especially in a personal way when, you are pregnant. And I also work with my church's pro-life ministry to read that abortions have increased in America and that there is still so much taxpayer funding that supports Planned Parenthood. And while we are technically protected from directly funding abortion through the Hyde Amendment, one thing that I've picked up on and learned from my journalistic background, interviewing a lot of people who are involved in pro-life ministry, is that it really is detrimental for so much taxpayer funding to go toward Planned Parenthood, because even if those funds don't directly fund abortion, one of Planned Parenthood's big strategies is access. And so a lot of times, they do offer other services besides just abortion, but they will place their clinics in communities where women are very vulnerable. A lot of times, poor communities or minority communities where women may not have health insurance or access to another doctor. So they'll go there for contraception. They'll go there for certain screenings. And then Planned Parenthood builds trust in those communities. And so when a woman gets pregnant, where is she going to turn? She's going to turn to the place she's turned before, Planned Parenthood, and they're going to lead her down the path to abortion. So we really do need to fight to defund Planned Parenthood completely, because we need to start directing those resources to other places that can actually help her and increase that access for women in need, so that they get truly supportive care in their pregnancy and afterward and beforehand, which I know you have been talking about during the show today, some ways that we can do that.
Yes, well, I love that you're transitioning us there, because you're so right that 80% of Planned Parenthoods are within walking distance to minority communities, and they have this really horrible history of eugenics in their past, where they openly were founded, and part of their mission originally was population control among minority groups. So that's all factual. That's all in the past. Planned Parenthood has yet to renounce that sordid history, but the answer is to defund them and fund holistic care for women and other health care for women. And I'm really excited because this is breaking news. So I'm sorry, guys, you didn't see this article yet, but it came out today. Texas filed a bill called the Every Mother Matters Act today, Emma. Arkansas already passed a version of this bill. And essentially the bill says before any woman goes to obtain an abortion, she will call and obtain a resource consultation. And a third party, independent of an abortion provider, will say, do you need employment? Do you need to sign up for insurance? Can we connect you with gynecological care? Whatever it is she needs to help stabilize her pregnancy or circumstances, including housing, that is made available to her, and she can voluntarily from there go and join the program and help get services for up to 2 years, which would include postpartum care and depression screenings, or she can choose not to further and take people up on their offer to assist. But it provides real, meaningful, tangible assistance for women who are often traditionally unemployed, already have children. They're having difficulty, feeding. Some don't have childcare, so they can continue to go to work. And there's a whole host of challenges that are actual, real, straightforward challenges women seeking abortion face. And then the bill also includes a human trafficking screen and domestic violence assistance, which I think is just so fundamental for populations that are sometimes vulnerable or preyed on by traffickers. So there's a whole host of benefits, in addition to maybe women will choose life if they actually feel supported, which would be incredible to see abortion rates decline regardless of what happens with Roe versus Wade. So Ben, I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? I know I'm just throwing this at you, but on a bill like that being filed in Texas and in Arkansas.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I was literally just telling our home church on Monday night about the import and the incredible pertinence of Christian greatness when it comes to children. So I think that not only protecting these children is of utmost importance, but also even emulating and modeling our lives off of them. I was thinking of how there's this bishop of Antioch in times of antiquity and days of yore who was nicknamed Theophilus, which literally means God carried, because there's this tradition that when the disciples and Jesus were debating amongst themselves who's the greatest, Jesus took a little child in his midst and put him up on his knee, and that child was Ignatius of Antioch, who would go on to become a martyr, and on his way to Rome, he didn't fear wild beasts and the cross and fire, just this epic saint. And so it's interesting how even as a child, when he was perhaps carried on Jesus' knee as a tradition, Theophilus, God carried, that he provides for us an example of what true greatness really looks like. So I think it's so important to discuss the legislation that just passed in Texas, for example, about caring for children. But let's remember that our goal is not only to protect children, but to actually model our entire lives on them, which again shows the importance of these little kids in our culture and in our society.
Right. And to it really counters the false narratives that are out there about the pro-life movement, because the pro-life movement has always been about caring for women. It's always been about stabilizing her and giving her long-term solutions, helping her family flourish. I mean, that is all in lockstep with the desire to protect life. So, Jonathan, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I love Ben just kind of giving a quick synopsis of what really has always been, as we said earlier, is the Christian story. And it's one of life, and it's one of loving people, and particularly, and this is a nuanced issue amongst many young adults, is where do women fit in the Christian narrative? And the answer is answered, I mean, Paul answers this in Galatians, that there's neither male nor female, slave or free. I mean, it's everyone is equal at the foot of the cross. And so this idea that we need, just going back to an earlier discussion, that we need Congress to write an Equality Act, they're really, really behind on what the Scripture has always been saying, which is that in Christ there already is an equal love and value for all people. And so when you import the implications of that into how we interact with one another, how we go about saving babies, loving moms, building families, it changes the conversation. And it's not a new position that Christians are taking. This has been the view, this has been the disposition of the gospel and classic Christianity for 2,000 years. And this is God's story among us, is that there is redemption and that there is love for all people. So I think it's important for young adults to understand the conversation can change when you choose to look at it through a different lens, which for us would be the gospel.
Right. And just to add to that like it's not enough for our Christian values to stay in our pews and in our churches and in our homes. Like we have to perpetuate those values outside of our worship services, because if we don't, there is an enemy on the other side that is perpetuating evil. And so us saying we've got to move into these spaces, continue to speak truth in love, and preach the gospel, but also preach other truths in the gospel, and then have that translate into culture and hopefully eventually our government and legality. Liberty, we're going to go to a break in a minute, but did you have any last things you want to add before we move on next segment?
Yeah, one thing that I love that you've told us about about Emma, the Every Mother Matters Act, is just that there is that support for 2 years, not just during the pregnancy, because I think a lot of women who may be in these very vulnerable situations, they're looking and saying, okay, well, are you just going to support me during my pregnancy so that I choose life and have the baby, and then what? Because I do have to find childcare. It is expensive. I've got to get formula and diapers and find a job and, all these things. And so that's another way that as the church, we can step in and continue to provide care for families, even when they're not pregnant. And then I love that the bill does this too. And that's just another example of pro-lifers saying, yes, we actually do care about life after pregnancy. We want to be there for the whole journey.
Yes. And it does require the community, because ultimately those types of resources come from private and public resources. It comes from nonprofits and churches, and really any group that's mission is to help and serve women of domestic violence. Safeway houses, all of those have to exist, and in order to support vulnerable populations. So it really works together beautifully, especially as the body of Christ, to lean into these areas. So thank you guys for your perspective on this. I think it's really important. Everybody watch out for Emma. EveryMotherMattersAct.com is where you can learn more about it. And hopefully it'll be filed in many other places. After this quick break we're about to be on, we are going to talk about Texas and how communities really coalesced in light of the snowstorm, and a little bit about renewable energy. We have to after the break.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman today, your host for the Millennial Roundtable, and we were talking about Planned Parenthood's numbers that just came out and some of the devastating impacts of abortion on the community, but also a new act that's been filed, and it's passed in Arkansas. It was filed today in Texas called the Every Mother Matters Act, and it's really, I think, the answer to abortion. It provides help and assistance for women in need. So go back and listen last segment if you want to hear more about those topics. You can read about them also on pointofview.net. But today we're going to turn to talking about Texas because we had a historic week last week. We're just going to say it. And I know Ben Courson is on the line, not from Texas, but thank you for joining us, Ben. I can't wait to talk to you a little bit about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, we were talking about kind of community outreach because we were talking about how communities do come around women in their times of need, in their unexpected pregnancy. And one area that we saw communities doing that was really refreshing was last week in Texas because historic winter storms came through. And I know a lot of our listening audience is not in Texas. And so even my sister who grew up in Texas and is now in California called me last week and was like, what's going on? I don't understand. But it was about 2 degrees. Sometimes like wind chill was in the negatives last week. And while that happened, the weather outside was frightful. Inside, the ERCOT is the big organization in charge of regulating the energy. They said, we're going to start doing rolling blackouts to ensure that a real blackout doesn't happen. And so what that translated into was some people had energy. Some people had real rolling blackouts. So energy on and off, like Liberty you had, where it was like, okay, we get an hour of heat, an hour no heat. And then a lot of people just had like a functional blackout, which was what category I fell into, which was 10 hours of no heat, an hour of heat. So when my house got in the 40s, and I have 3 children under 4 and a 9-month-old, we left and found people with heat and luckily went and lived with them. But the roads were snowy and treacherous. Then there was a water crisis that happened because everybody was running their pipes, so their pipes wouldn't freeze and burst. So they ran out of water, so everyone was on a boil notice to boil the water that you did have out of your faucets because it wasn't being, I guess, it wasn't safe to drink anymore. It wasn't being what do they call it? Purified. Yeah, that's right. To the right degree. So then there was a water crisis a few days later that compounded. And then as the pipes did thaw, a lot of them broke across the state. And so people had flooding in their houses. Just like pretty devastating. I've heard stories of like my friend's father who is in a nursing home or a care facility, like having issues getting people to come care for him because people couldn't get to work. Grocery store had some food shortages. So we would say this is like a very devastating crisis in Texas, as many of you have heard. So the good news is communities did come around during this time and give each other firewood and care for each other. Did you see any of that in your community, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, we did. And it was really, just as we were talking about earlier, it was really amazing to see people kind of put aside a lot of the stuff that, has been preoccupying us. And I know we always say this in crisis times and in times where things kind of jar us out of our normal routine and all that kind of stuff. But especially, I would say, you never, I don't know a better way to say this, Chelsey, like you never want people to have to go through crisis. I want to be very clear about that. Certainly because that particular storm, people lost their lives, major health fallout, hypothermia. I mean, they were, I was hearing stories in Austin and downtown where literally homeless folks were dying on the street. It was incredibly, incredibly sad and frustrating several days here in Texas. And it's still going to be for millions of Texans trying to wait on clean water, get their power restored with regularity, all that kind of stuff. It's ongoing. One of the things, though, that is always the reality of crisis, I've found in my own life personally, and I think just this is true within communities, is that it forces us to stop and pay attention to other people and think outside of ourselves. and stop and realize that I might not agree with everything my neighbor does or says, but they are my neighbor. And this is a gospel imperative that so many young adults, I know just because this is the Millennial Roundtable, we need to keep bright lights on this issue. So many young adults, we don't wish for crisis. We don't want there to be fallout, and we don't want people to experience traumatic loss. We never want that. But we have to realize as Christians, when it happens, there is and Jesus talks about this in his story in Luke's Gospel about the Good Samaritan. You can't just drive by people in need and ignore them. And there's a gospel imperative there that when we see hurt and need and loss and trouble, as Christians, we stop. And I was so proud of so many Christians and churches in our city and all across Texas this past week who they got outside themselves and they stopped and they helped somebody. And in doing so, not in a roundabout way, but in a very direct way. Churches did it, individual believers did it, groups of people, small groups did it, and they got on mission, as we like to say a lot of times. And they just took the time to say, you have a need, I'm going to help meet it. Nobody had to tell me to do it. I didn't need to get text alerts from my church. I just knew to do it. And it's a reflex, a gospel reflex, sometimes it's called, that it's good for us to flex that muscle spiritually, so to speak. So we don't want it to happen. We don't wish for it to happen. But when it does, we get proactive and we say, hey, you're my neighbor, and I'm going to do something to make your day better. And that's a big deal.
Absolutely. Liberty, did you see your community coming around and how did they, what did you witness last week?
Yes, definitely a lot of camaraderie in my community. I live in a smaller town in North Texas, and it's been a microcosm of the division we've seen nationally in the past year or so. With people on the Facebook groups bickering about, everything from small town issues to big national political issues. And then it was just like all of that stopped, and you had neighbors saying, here, I'll lend you my shovel so that you can get out of your driveway. We had neighbors giving us firewood because we didn't realize we needed to stock up ahead of time. We had churches and community centers and other houses of worship in the area opening up to be warming centers. We had local city officials passing out water bottles, and we weren't saying, hey, did you vote for Trump, or did you support this, city council member in the recent election, or, what is your thoughts on, whatever. It was just, hey, we need to help each other survive. And so even as tragic as it was, if looking for silver linings, I was able to just really be blessed by how many people in our community came together and focused on what truly mattered and helping each other in that time.
I love that. Ben, I know you're not from here, but I think you're in Washington, aren't you? You're in a northern state.
I live in Oregon, and I split my time between here and Southern California. So I know this might not be the most pertinent subject for me to address, but I definitely have a lot of thoughts about it. And especially listening to you guys talk, I love how this crisis, though I believe it's authored by the enemy, is redeemed by God in this sense, that it causes people to work across the aisle. And this kind of crisis shows us that the Christ who unites us is greater than the differences that otherwise divide us. Like you said, nobody really is asking who'd you vote for. People are just looking to give each other fire and warmth. And the interesting thing is this is Christianity at its best, how it was really meant to be. So, for example, I know I kind of pull back to history because I'm just a history nerd, but basically I think of in the year AD 251 how 5,000 people a day were dying in Rome alone. The emperor had died. There was a disease that was spreading. The pagan priests fled, and the only way to really have a strong chance of survival was to know a Christian, because the Christians were the ones providing bread and water. And I think that this crisis is actually showing that crisis in the midst of it. And I hope that that's what the world can say of Christians today, that our best chance of surviving is knowing a Christian.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, I know that we did see a lot of that here. And of course, I said this in our first hour, but it wouldn't be like a crisis if there wasn't some politicalization of it. And so when we get back, we are going to talk about the energy crisis in Texas and what that's translated into. But before we go there, I will say that AOC, who's traditionally loves the Green New Deal, very, very liberal, she raised millions of dollars for Texas. I think she flew down and helped distribute water in the Houston area. So there has really been some really positive bipartisan assistance here. President Biden has been surprisingly missing. I think that is worth noting for anyone who's not paying attention, that we haven't really seen him do much to give assistance or help to Texans. And I know a lot of Texans are talking about being disappointed by that. And then, of course, Ted Cruz, there was a scandal there because he flew to Cancun in the middle of this crisis, which is very warm and would have been amazing if not for the fact that he should have been helping Texans. So it's interesting responses on a lot of different fronts. But one thing that I know for sure is Texans were really grateful to see warm weather and things thaw out. And you can continue to pray, because I do know Houston, large parts of Houston, they're still without water there. And so praying for safe, drinkable water and any other potential fallout on the resource side of this that we're going to see as people continue to reel, and there's price gouging, there's all kinds of things. But Texans are warm now. It's been 75, and I hope that we can recover from this in a really positive way. So stay tuned. We're going to one of our breaks. When we get back, we're going to talk about renewable energy and the not so renewable energy, and where we stand on that in the future in the state of Texas.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, thanks for joining us on the Millennial Roundtable today. I'm Chelsey Youman, and we are talking about the Texas crisis and how beautiful it was to see the communities come around and help each other last week. But we did say that there's already been political partisan talk come out of the issue that happened last week, which is when the snowstorm hit and there was an energy crisis. So you can read more about this topic or any of the other topics we've discussed on the show today on pointofview.net, or follow us live on Point of View Radio on Facebook. But right now we're going to say that the first people I heard to talk about the energy crisis was on the left, saying that this was a great example of why the Green New Deal should be spread and increased, and that renewable energy should be increased. So green and friendly energy should be increased. And then on the left, we heard the opposite, or the right, the opposite. So Governor Abbott came out and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick stating that there were a lot of failures on all fronts, and that we really have to reconsider this. So just a little bit of facts to guide us here. 39% of the energy of solar and wind is what made up our energy last week, and 97% of that failed. And so a lot of the question has been, they all failed. So the wind and solar panels, everything froze. And then some of the generators actually producing, we had plenty of gas and oil energy, but those generators to distribute it froze. And so for me, the question is not really what percentage of our energy was delegated to which area. It's how did they do? Like, how reliable were they when we needed them? And 97% of wind and solar energy failed, but only like 30% of the other gas energy failed. So, Ben, I'm going to start with you because I'd love to get your perspective on this. You know, Texas is an oil and gas state, and it's not that anyone's against renewable energy. It's just that when there was a crisis, it didn't turn out to be that reliable. There's going to be lots of investigations already occurring. The hearings started today in the legislature where these groups were called in front, and there's lots of questions being asked. There's been lots of resignations happening. So it's definitely something that Texas is taking very seriously. But what are your thoughts when you read all of this? And I love your insight.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to kind of present sort of the arguments from both sides, and then I kind of want to offer actually a bigger picture. So on one hand, the frozen wind turbines have contributed to the state's energy crisis, but then on the other side, the argument is, well, natural gas, basically the state's more dominant energy source, has provided drastically less energy than expected. But the point of the matter is, I think the immediate threat right now. So I remember, I think when this was starting, however long ago it started, I was actually in Oregon reading this, and it was like surprisingly cold that day. And then I was opening up the news, and it said like this cold front sweeping through the states. One kid died of cold falling through the ice. Another homeless person, as Jonathan referenced, died of the cold, died of just the cold weather. A couple others tried to heat their houses literally by turning on their car inside of their house. And the carbon dioxide actually killed them. So this is what I want to really address, though, and kind of take it to a big picture. And that is, I think a lot of people can look at this moment and say, you know, juxtaposing natural gas, wind turbines, what's freezing. I want to really remind people, though, that this crisis does not come from God. And as we work together to meet the immediate crisis, just like you were saying, taking steps to make sure that we're caring for those in need, that's the most important thing. Because I just want to point this out, because I always try to tell people this. Jesus said the enemies come to steal, kill, and destroy. So the thief, he said, has come to steal, kill, and destroy. So when people like maybe come on Christian TV and they're like, this is the Lord's judgment against America. He said that he sent this cold front and caused these turbines to freeze over because of his, you know, wrath against our country. I just want to remind people that's not theology, that's thiefology. Like, the thief is the one who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus said, I have come to give life and not more abundantly. In fact, even in the story of Job, you remember a storm actually killed his family. And he said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But really, he didn't realize that it was the Lord who gives and the enemy who takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The enemy was the one who caused the storm to happen. But I think that in light of all of this, what it does make us do is not only care for each other, but relook at what are the most efficient, economical, and long-term benefits, like lasting advantages that will come from really putting our heads together and working for something that will prove more advantageous during this energy crisis, even technologically. So I kind of like bringing it back to that big picture a little bit. But what's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying, and want to add to it that like we have a duty to learn from it, and should not have probably been in this position to begin with. The industry was largely deregulated. Efforts to regulate it failed about 10 years ago when there was another snowstorm that happened that was very problematic for the grid. And so we do have a duty to look around and say, how do we steward this well and steward each other well? I know that $7.2 billion were poured into the renewable energy. And while maybe that was good to subsidize at the time and see how it worked, we now know that like maybe it doesn't work as well as we should, and we need to ask those questions. And they are being asked. Right. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on both that big picture? I love that perspective Ben brought. Did you have anything to add to his points?
Yeah, and it goes back to some of what we were saying about the whole idea of how the worldview conversations drive so much of the policy decisions. But I think Ben camps on a really important point, and so let's just kind of for a second here as we wind down today, think about a number of young adults. They see images on social media of people being displaced from their homes, freezing, no food, no water. And there's an empathetic pivot that happens in the hearts and minds, and should, by the way, of people, and young people in particular, who look at that and say, well, that's not right. What was the cause? And so I think Ben has rightly identified what's going to be an ongoing conversation for a lot of young people in particular, which is, causation is often a driver for a lot of people's running towards or away from matters of faith. And if you've derived that God's just super mad with everybody, so he's sending us ice storms, well, you may have a very limited view of the gospel. Simultaneously, if we just want to go around pillaging the earth and under-resourcing the people that live in our cities, well, that's a stewardship question as well. So again, not to beat a drum too loudly here, but it's an important drum. When we derive our worldview from what the Scripture says, we understand that God's called us to subdue and steward the earth, not destroy it. But at the same time, we shouldn't be a slave to worldviews that are antithetical to the gospel. So I think we look at it as an energy crisis, and we look at last week as an outlier in Texas, but it raises an interesting question, which is, what are the paradigms that we're embracing, particularly as younger people become the thought leaders, like AOC, for instance, in the Congress and other places? What is the worldview that's going to drive those policy decisions? And so it's a conversation Christians should run to, not away from, and we shouldn't be scared as we engage on the merits, not just of what's happening in our climate, but what is happening in our communities, in our cities, about the way people look at taking care of one another and using resources. I agree, real quick, Chelsey. I agree we can be super creative and wield technology while also being consistent with a biblical worldview when crisis moments like last week happen.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. It was really a beautiful thing to see people being human to each other again and caring again, especially after COVID, I feel like has really distanced people from even looking each other in the eye. But before we close out, we have just a quick second here. Jonathan, I'd love for you to give your quick, how can people access you? And then Ben, it'll be your turn.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Jonathan_Teague and try to tweet as much as I can. But yeah, we're out there for sure.
Great. And Ben, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, yeah, you can find all my content at bencourson.com, or just literally Google Hope Generation, and you can find like 700 videos on YouTube and our TV show and all that stuff.
Love it. Thank you, Ben. Liberty, last but not least.
I'm at libertymacArtor.com, and you can find my social media and my writing there.
Great. And I'm Chelsey Youman. I'm with Human Coalition Action, where we're doing pro-life legislation that's helpful for helping families and children. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to have you listen in next time.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.